Hi everyone. This is Denise Wilson, and I am your host today for Adam's webinar on the Two-Midnight Rule. And David Glaser is our special guest today, and I'm just really excited to have him with us today. And I'll be introducing him shortly.
I thought you were calling me Adam, Denise.
So if you're new to GoToWebinar, there is a control panel that you should have on your screen that you can open and close with a little red arrow. You can select if you want to listen to computer audio or call in via phone call. You can download the handouts under the Handouts tab. So you can download them right now. I know some of you have trouble because you're behind firewalls. You guys are at work and so forth. We also have them posted on our home site, www.ahdam.org, on our home page. You can download them from there as well. There's kind of like an orange square next to the announcement of today's webinar. You can download the slides there. If you're not able to download them from either place, you can put your email in the questions box and say that you need the slides, and we will email them do the best we can to email them to you during the presentation. But please try to download them on your own first, because we have a huge number of attendees today. We will try to save a few minutes at the end for questions. Even if we don't get to your questions today live, we will try do our best to answer them afterwards. So if you have questions about the content, please put them in the questions panel. The CEUs are free only if you are an Adam member as of midnight tonight, so you still have time to sign up. You have to be on the live webinar for at least 50 minutes, and there is a survey that will pop up at the end that you have to complete. We will email the CEUs to you within about a week. We are recording this webinar. It'll be on our website in about a week, and you can watch it from there for free, but we do not offer CEUs if you're just watching the recording. No individuals in a position to control content for this activity have any relevant financial relationships to declare. Once you do the survey for the CEUs, we do offer CEUs from 5 different organizations, and so you can pick as many of those organizations as you'd like to receive a continuing education certificate from. Our next webinar is Wednesday, January 25th at 2 p.m., and it's going to be on the anatomy of successful medical necessity appeals. We'll talk about inpatient and outpatient appeals. People ask all the time, what do I need to include? What's too much information? So we'll talk about all that because I get asked that question a lot. Again, we'll have CEUs for our Adam members only. You can go to our webpage and register now. The registration link is live. A little bit about us. We are the nation's only association dedicated to those of you who are working in healthcare denial and appeal management. We've had tremendous growth this year and continue to grow. Our mission is to support and promote professionals who work in this arena, and our vision is to create an even playing field so that we can be just successful in persuading medical insurers to make proper payment decisions. That's all we're asking for, is that their payment decisions be fair. The association publishes and distributes materials on our website that's created by our members or industry subject matter experts for the benefits of our members. We don't certify the accuracy or authority of the materials. They are distributed and presented solely as research for your use in conjunction with other research that you deem necessary. We claim no liability in relation to reliance on the content of these materials. The views expressed are the views of the material's authors, do not necessarily represent the views of Adam. Any references are provided for informational purposes only and do not constitute endorsement of any sources. I am president of the Adam Association. I'm also senior vice president at PayerWatch and Appeal Masters. I've been in healthcare for well over 30 years. And I've been in denial and appeal management for the past 17 years and primarily do a lot of education and managing of the association these days. So our special guest today is David Glaser. He's an attorney and shareholder at Fredikson and Byron. He helps clinics, hospitals, and other healthcare entities negotiate the maze of healthcare regulations. He provides advice about strategy, reimbursement, and compliance. He is a shareholder in Fredikson and Byron's Health Law Group, co-founded its Healthcare Fraud and Compliance Group. He has considerable experience in healthcare regulation and litigation, including voluntary disclosures, criminal and civil fraud investigations, overpayments, and reimbursement disputes. His goal is to explain the government's enforcement position and to analyze whether this position is supported by law or represents government overreaching. You may be familiar with him because he's a frequent guest on RAC Monitor Mondays. I think you are a fixture there, actually. And you can read his blog at Orthopedics Today, and he's given speeches in 36 states. Well, let's hope you can get to the other 14 states sooner than later. And he's also on our advisory board of ADAM, and so I'm just thrilled to have him here today. So I'm going to turn control over to David and let him present his information. Okay, so David, I think you have control. You want to check it out?
Awesome. I am checking it out. I do indeed have control. Oh, I have control, and I've misused it already. Blowing the control right out of the chute. So I will say I'm happy. I have been to all 50 states, but I have not yet spoken at them. And I know I'm a little backlit. I picked this room in part because sometimes an eagle will cruise by, and it gives you, like when you're bored with me, it gives you a chance you can do something else, right? You can see what else happens in the background. And the waves, I'm on Lake Superior right now, and the waves are going crazy. So I am going to start us off with 3 bangs here. Pretty early on, I've got 3 contests. So this is the first of the 3 contests. They have nothing to do with the Two-Midnight Rule, but they'll add a little zip to it. So this movie, it involves Barbra Streisand and Robert Redford together again. It was in 1973. I was like 6 years old. What movie is this? And so I think you put the answer in the chat, and as soon as Denise sees the first person with the right answer, that person will get. I mean, and these prizes, I don't want to oversell them, right? Like these are tchotchke kinds of things, right? But you know, it's better than poking the eye with a sharp stick. How are we doing?
Put your answers in the questions box. I don't think we have. I don't think they have chat, and we have a winner already. Sherry Wayne.
Okay, so the winner is The Way We Were, and the reason I'm going with The Way We Were is the first thing I want to do in this talk is go in the past. So what I'm about to do is not current. This is what the Medicare Benefit Policy Manual used to say before we had the Two-Midnight Rule. So this is now going back a long time. The Two-Midnight Rule took effect October 1st, 2013. So 9 years ago, right? Before that, the manual said an inpatient is a person who's been admitted to a hospital for bed occupancy for purposes of receiving inpatient hospital services. Generally, a patient is considered an inpatient if formally admitted as an inpatient, with the expectation that he or she will remain at least overnight and occupy a bed, even though it later develops that they can be discharged. I feel weird reading slides, but this is a quote and it's important. And we're going to the next slide. Well, Oh, okay. There we go. All right. I'm getting the control thing done. There's a bit of a lag on my end, so I'm going to apologize. I'm going to have this problem more than once, I suspect. Physicians should use a 24-hour period as a benchmark, i.e., they should order admission for patients who are expected to need hospital care for 24 hours or more and treat other patients on an outpatient basis. However, the decision to admit a patient is a complex medical judgment which can be made only after the physician has considered numerous factors, the patient's medical history, I'm going to go blah, blah, blah. So here's my question for you. This one is not for a prize, and you don't have to do anything with it. Just think, it's a thought experiment. Before the Two-Midnight Rule, what was the standard? So the slide said that generally you're considered an inpatient if you're formally admitted, expected to be overnight. That was the first test. Then there was another test, use 24 hours as a benchmark. Now, if you are in Alaska and you are north of the Arctic Circle, there is a period of time when overnight and 24 hours are the same. But for all of the rest of us, those are 2 different tests. Overnight and 24 hours aren't the same. And then there was, however, it's a complex determination based on a variety of things. Now, I'm starting with this, even though it is not the rules today, because I want you all to learn an important lesson from what happened then. Dozens of hospitals repaid millions of dollars because they had people who were admitted as inpatients and who didn't stay 24 hours. There was no requirement there that you had to stay 24 hours. First, this was a manual provision, and we'll briefly talk about it, but manuals aren't binding. But let's pretend it was binding. The instruction said if you expected the person to be there overnight, you could admit him as an inpatient. And everyone sort of blew over that and went with 24 hours as a benchmark, ignoring the first part of the writing. And so I'm talking about this at some length and in rather exercised fashion, because all kinds of consultants sold people bills of goods, and the government made people pay money back when they shouldn't have. And it is really, really important to read this stuff carefully. So that was the old rule. Actually, it isn't that different from the Two-Midnight Rule if you substitute overnight if you've replaced that with 2 nights. That is a pretty good explanation for the Two-Midnight Rule. So this is our next contest. This is for fans of 80s music. And if you listen to me on Monitor Monday, you know that is me. So who sang What Did All the People? It's actually What Do, but for this purpose is What Did All of the People Know? So the name of the group that sang What Do All the People Know? So all kinds of people refunded a ton of money, all right? Also, they did a lot of these refunds. They would say, oh, this admission didn't meet the InterQual guidelines. We've got a winner?
Got a winner. Michaela.
And so who knew? Was that one more time?
Michaela Arbaugh is the winner.
Okay, thank you, Michaela. So Michaela knows that it's the Monroes who sing this. And you'll have to send me contact information for these folks. I'm putting work on you, which is really unfair, so I apologize.
No problem.
So people use InterQual and Milliman, now CMG, but there's nothing in here about anything other than this Two-Midnight thing, but people were using these proprietary tools to come up with the determination, no basis for that. There was a big investigation involving kyphoplasty, where they went after all kinds of hospitals for admitting people and claiming it was unnecessary. Really frustrating to me, all right? So I'm teaching you this in part because this kind of stuff happens a lot, and I want you to be skeptical of things. Our final contest, I'm just whipping them off. Kind of hard to tell what's going on here, but you will see those dots are stars. There's also a line. So the question is, it kind of looks like it's a cigar. Close, but no cigar. It's not a cigar. So I saw this. I was up here at my cabin, and I saw this in the night sky. And I'm like, are we being invaded by flying saucers? And the answer is no. What is it? And the reason I'm putting that up is because it's really important to know what it is you're looking at and whether it's important and what it is. So I'm not going to give this one too much longer. I will move on to the next slide and start talking about it. We'll see if anyone gets it, and I'll come back and tell you the answer if no one does. So I want to talk briefly about the regulatory hierarchy. So the Constitution is at the tippy top of all legal stuff, right? It doesn't come up too much in healthcare things, but it can a little. Statutes matter a lot. And if there is a statute on point, and we usually look to the Social Security Act for Medicare stuff, if you were dealing with state law, you look to your state code. Then there are regulations. And actually, national coverage determinations are just like a regulation, because we'll look at a statute in a minute. It kind of gives them the same authority as a statute. In the state, you have the state administrative code. So those, in the federal level, you have the CFR, or the Code of Federal Regulations. Those are basically binding. So Denise, how are we doing? We could give it up on the third one, and I'll just tell people what it is.
We do have, we have like Starlink satellite. I mean, I don't know.
Starlink is correct. So it's
okay. That was
Starlink satellite
too. Yeah.
It is
Starlink.
Starlink.
Our own Larry Hagelin.
So Elon Musk's satellites that are giving internet to people And when they launch them, they're all close together and then they spread out. But when they're first launched, they're a line in the sky. So, all right, now back to the webinar already in progress. Everything else that I have not mentioned on that first slide is not binding. So manuals, and we all think about manuals and we look at them a lot, not binding. Local coverage determinations, LCDs, not binding. FAQs from contractors, not binding. I'm not calling them irrelevant. You can learn from them, but they don't have the authority of law. And if they contradict something that's in law, they're not valid. So one question is, how do I know this, right? Am I just making this up? And the answer is no. So this is a provision of the Social Security Act. And it says, no rule, requirement, or other statement of policy other than a national coverage determination that establishes or changes a legal standard is going to take effect unless it's promulgated by the Secretary by regulation, okay? So this is where when I say national coverage determinations are like regulations, I'm basing it on this law. So here's a law that says if it's not a rule, it can't limit Medicare coverage. And when I say rule, I mean regulation. I don't mean something that's put out by a contractor, and I don't mean something that's in the manuals. Now, I have been to court a number of times, and here's one that I lost. And I told my client there's no way we can lose this appeal. And we did lose. So was I wrong? No, I wasn't wrong, because when I said there was no way we could lose, here's what I meant. We went to court to argue that we weren't bound by a provision of the manuals. This happened to be a case involving a TEFRA cost report appeal. That's not super important, but basically my client had relied on something in the manuals for the date of when an appeal was due. And the manual said as long as you mailed it on time, you were okay. The regulation said it had to be received on time. So they mailed it on time. It was received 1 day later, which was 1 day late, and the contractor denied the appeal. So we applied to get it reinstated. And I figured if we won, great, we had our appeal. If we lost, we would have a court case that says manuals aren't binding. Well, we got the latter, right? And you can kind of see the government in a brief said, you rely on information in the manuals at your own peril. In a case in the early 90s, when I was a baby lawyer, the government said, manuals aren't binding. They're not accorded that weight in the adjudicatory process. So the government knows that manuals are not binding. So next, we just have a few. My hobby is storm chasing. And these are just mostly in here for a little break. It's important, once again, to know what you're looking at, right? So here, I'm having some technical issues. Here, that you get stuck on the lightning. You're so busy looking at the lightning, you don't notice what's going on down below. That there were actually 3 tornadoes on the ground. And it is really easy to get distracted when you look at a statute. So let's crack out the Two-Midnight Rule. Here we are 15 minutes into this and just getting to the Two-Midnight Rule. You can mock me if you want. This is actually not that hard a rule. So for purposes of payment under Medicare Part A, an individual is considered an inpatient of a hospital. And I never know why they put critical access hospitals separately. That's a hospital still. If formally admitted as an inpatient pursuant to an order for inpatient admission by a physician or other qualified practitioner in accordance with some rules. Now I've got a sentence that's crossed out here. So why did I put in a crossed out sentence? Let's read it and we will explain why I put it in later. So this physician order must be present in the medical record and be supported by the physician admission and progress notes. All right, that's crossed out. Just remember that is crossed out. I want to emphasize that. In addition to these physician orders, inpatient rehab facilities must adhere to their admission requirements. Okay, great, goody. So, why was that crossed out? Well, the government decided 4 years ago to change their requirements, all right? They are revising the inpatient order requirement. Here is the text as to when that happened. And CMS basically said, we are not in our regulation going to require a written order anymore. So they struck that language. All right, so we're now back to the Two-Midnight Rule already in progress. So there's the language that is gone, right? That's why it's gone. The order must be furnished by a qualified and licensed practitioner who has admitting privileges at the hospital. I'm just going to do a quick aside here. I get asked sometimes a hospital will have a doctor who did something they don't have privileges to do, and I get asked, do I need to refund? If it's a surgery they didn't have privileges to do, I would say you don't need to refund. But if they've admitted the person to the hospital and they lack admitting privileges, I think there's a pretty good argument they need to refund because of this regulation. So you have to have admitting privileges. You have to be knowledgeable about the patient's course of care. Now, the practitioner can delegate the order to another person. They can't delegate it to another person if they don't have the authority to admit patients and they don't have admitting privileges. The physician order has to be furnished at or before the time of the inpatient admission. So I underlined the word furnished. Why did I underline it? What does it mean? Well, it doesn't mean it has to be written, and we know that because they struck the written part, right? So you can furnish an order orally. This is maybe as good a time as any to just mention something. People often talk about verbal orders. I am a word maven. I will never refer to a verbal order because all orders are verbal. Verbal just means it has words. An oral order is an order spoken aloud. A written order is one written down. Verbal orders have words. So no one in healthcare talks about oral orders, but they should, because that's not a verbal order isn't precise. So this is the lawyer in me coming through. I like to use my words very carefully. All right. So, except as provided in paragraphs D2 and D3, an inpatient admission is generally appropriate for payment under A when the admitting physician expects the patient to require hospital care that crosses 2 midnight. This is the 2-midnight rule. It is actually one of the easiest regulations I deal with. I can explain this to a 5-year-old. If the doctor thinks the patient needs to be in the hospital for 2 midnights, they can be admitted. That is it. There's nothing else, right? You don't have to meet InterQual. You don't have to meet MCG. There's nothing. The doctor has to expect the patient to require hospital care for 2 midnights. Now, I suppose there's one interesting question, which is, what does it mean to require hospital care? And we'll talk more about that in a bit. But that is the only requirement, the need for hospital care for 2 midnights. The expectation should be based on, and it's an expectation. It is not what actually happens. We don't care what actually happens. It is at the moment they choose to admit, what do they expect? The expectation should be based on complex medical factors such as the patient's history and comorbidities, the severity of signs and symptoms, current medical needs, and the risk of an adverse event. I really want to emphasize that because we're going to come back to the adverse event. So the factors that lead to a particular clinical expectation must be documented in the medical record in order to be granted consideration. I don't love that sentence. Generally, there is not a requirement for documentation in the Medicare program. Here there is, right? The regulation says the medical record has to have the factors. Now, does that mean the doctor had to have the factors recorded? Doesn't say that. Does it say the admission order has to mention them? It does not. It just says they have to be in the record. So they can be anywhere in the record, but they have to be in the record. If an unforeseen circumstances arise, such as the beneficiary's death or transfer, the patient may be considered appropriately still an inpatient, right? So it's all about expectation. So then D2 and D3, which were mentioned before, actually they expand coverage a little bit. And so they say, if you're on the inpatient only list, I'm not gonna read this whole slide because it's dense. But basically, if you're on the inpatient only list, you're good to go. And if you get removed from the inpatient only list, there are still times you might be good to go, okay? Now, here is, to me, the most difficult question about this, which is, when should a physician expect the person to be, well, actually, here, I do want to go back one slide for a second, because I want to look at that last paragraph. For services and procedures removed after January 1st, 2021, the exemption will last until the Secretary determines that the service or procedures is more commonly performed in the outpatient setting. So what does more commonly mean in that context? And this kind of gets to when should a physician expect a two-midnight stay? Is more commonly the test we should use. So in my mind, more commonly means 50%, right? As soon as if it's either inpatient or outpatient, it's 50-50. And so as soon as it's 51 or 50.1 to 49.9, that's when it is more commonly. Is that when a physician should expect a two-midnight stay? If you think there's a 50.1% chance that they're in for two midnights, is that the test to use? I do not know the answer to this. I feel like that's not a bad one to be. The things I struggle with are, do you do it on a procedure level or on a patient-specific level, right? So let's say an appendicitis, and I know this does not have typically a two-night, but I'm going to use appendicitis. Well, so let's make it a total knee. Let's say that that the average length of stay for a total knee is 2 nights. Is that enough? Or do you have to slice it up and say that the average for a 65-year-old is 1.5, but for an 80-year-old, it's 2.3, right? I don't know the answer to that exactly, and in fact, it isn't clear in this regulation, and that is the only really hard thing to me about the two-midnight rule. And there we go. So, some of you may have read What Do You Expect When You're Expecting at some point in your life. I don't know how a physician is supposed to decide what an expectation is. According to Oxford, if it's likely to happen, you expect it. Merriman thinks that it will probably happen. Now, I would say likely and probably are different, with likely being more, it's a higher standard to me to be likely than probably, right? The National Weather Service defines likely as 60 or 70% chance. Now, note, that's not one number, right? That's two different numbers. So when does a doctor expect an overnight, a two-midnight stay? That's a good question. That's the thing I'm going to leave you with and not definitively answer, okay? So then D3 talks about if the doctor thinks that the patient has got a complex problem that's going to require, basically a lot of work, right? It's only a limited time, but it's still going to, it's complex. They've got lots of comorbidities. You can still admit them. This one is also very non-specific. I call it it's a really sick patient who's not going to be there for a long time. To me, one possible example is critical care where you think they might die within 24 hours and you're not sure, right? So they're going to be getting intensive services, but you're not sure they'll make it 2 nights. They can fall into this sort of safety bucket. So the bottom line is that physician expectation controls. If the doctor doesn't expect a two-midnight stay, they shouldn't admit them, unless you've got that sort of intense care exception that you're meeting. The government has the ability to assert that you need to have a physician order, and they also have the ability to say there has to be support for the order in the medical record. Those are 2 things the government can insist on. Now, I want to dig in a little bit in the manuals. And to do this properly, you got to think for a moment about Doctor Who. So this is the TARDIS. I was unfamiliar with this until my daughter got me into Doctor Who. So thank you, Zoe. Let's look at this is the current manual provision on the two-midnight rule. So I don't know if you pay attention to the gobbledygook at the top of manual provisions, but let's look at this one and dissect it. So it's Medicare Benefit Policy Manual, Section 10, that's the 10. And we see Rev 234, so that's revision number 234. Look at the date it was issued, so March 10th, 2017. Look when it was effective. it was effective 14 months before it was written. That is not okay. That does not work, right? You cannot have your child get home at 11 o'clock at night and say, I had a 10 o'clock curfew for you. I didn't tell you, but you're just supposed to have known that. Like, that is not how things work in life. Wow, there's a lot of chutzpah there, all right? So just note that this is a time-traveling manual. I am focused primarily on Medicare here, but what about private payers? That's a good question. So if you've got a contract with the private payer, that contract will control. And the odds are decent that the contract is going to try to impose their manuals on you as well. If you don't have a contract with the payer, you're in what's called an implied contract, and industry norms govern the situation. So basically, every private insurer is its own spiel. Now, I know a bunch of you are thinking, what about Medicare Advantage plans? And in fact, we even mentioned that in the promo for this because it comes up so often. Most of the time in life, I say Medicare Advantage plans are really private payers. And the reason I say that is because you contract with them, and functionally, they are not required to follow Medicare rules. But they are required to do one thing. They have to be at least as generous as Medicare. And the way we know this is Social Security Act Section 1852 requires that Medicare Advantage plans provide benefits under the original Medicare fee-for-service program. They have to provide the benefits, right? So if the original Medicare program includes as a benefit, Medicare Advantage does too. It also requires the plans to comply with the general guidelines included in the original Medicare manuals and instructions, unless superseded by regulation in this part or related instructions. I would use this to say that whatever the Medicare Advantage plan does, it has to be at least as generous as the Two-Midnight Rule. So operationalizing that, what does it mean? Can they have a one-midnight rule? I think they probably could, because that feels more generous to me to the beneficiary. Can they have a three-midnight rule? I would say they can't, because that feels less generous to me. So that's my take on it. I have heard CMS people claim that, in fact, it's up to the Medicare Advantage plan as to whether they want to follow the Two-Midnight Rule or not. I believe that those CMS people, when they say that, are disregarding this section of the Social Security Act. So since I know, I am a fan, you may not believe me, so I am a fan of putting up my source. And so this is just me putting up the source. So this is a regulation that's backing up the same thing, where it's, that the Medicare Advantage plan has to provide coverage by either furnishing or arranging for all services that are covered by Part A. So this is what I was just talking about, but you can see it right here in the text. So where do the proprietary tools fit in on this? Well, for Medicare, we don't give a rip about them. Maybe that's a little too harsh. Perhaps the proprietary tool can be useful in supporting the notion that the physician reasonably expected that the person would need to be in for 2 midnights, right? If there is some tool that says, hey, this gives you data about lengths of stay, that could be relevant for Medicare. But otherwise, any private company's tool doesn't matter. For private payers, could a private payer say you have to follow InterQual? Sure. If you agree to it, they can make you do it. If you don't agree to it, they can't just make you do it if you haven't contractually agreed to it. And one of the things I would just mention to you is you might want to work with your contracting people. If you're involved in appeals with private companies, your bed is made largely before the thing gets to you. It's made by the contract. And so whoever is doing your contracting has to understand how what they agree to will affect your ability to appeal. Now, many of you have probably already gathered I have an overdeveloped attachment to puns, and we've got a few of them coming. So this is manual overboard, or manual overbroad, actually, it could be. So remember that sentence that I showed you that was crossed out in the regulation? If you look in the manual today, this is what appears. The regulation at 42 CFR 412.3, that's what we had on the screen with the little cross out thingy, requires that as a condition of payment, an order for inpatient admission must be present in the medical record. Now, if you just read this in the manual and you said, we don't have a written order for admission, I think you would reasonably say it's a condition of payment, crud, we have to refund this money. Because generally speaking, conditions of payment, as the name might imply, means you have to meet this in order to get paid by Medicare. But it turns out that so remember I said before, manuals aren't binding, so this is just in the manual. Now it's quoting a regulation. If the regulation in fact said what this manual said it said, then we would be toast. It doesn't. Now, things get extra weird here. This is where things take a turn for the super crazy. This same section of the manual, after saying it's a condition of payment, goes on to say, in extremely rare circumstances, the order to admit may be missing or defective, that is, illegible, incomplete. For example, inpatient isn't specified, yet the intent is clear. In these extremely rare situations, contractors have been provided with the discretion to determine, basically, that an admission is okay. And it goes on at the bottom to say this narrow and limited alternative method of satisfying the requirement for documentation should be extremely rare and may only be applied at the discretion of the contractor. Now, this is really interesting. I was glad when they came out with this in the manual. A few points. So first, so if it can only be applied at the discretion of the contractor, what's that mean for you? Because if you haven't submitted a claim, the contractor is never going to have the ability to exercise any discretion. So you have to decide whether you're going to bill or not. And if you didn't have a written order, were you supposed to not bill because it was up to the, I mean, I don't know how to operationalize this, is I guess what I'm saying. And I did appreciate it when they came out with this, except for one little thing. That isn't what the Met regulation says anymore, right? Because they changed it. So what do you do with this language? Well, first of all, remember that manuals aren't binding, right? I think the manual can be more generous than the regulations, but it can't be less. But that language was removed 4 years ago now, in 2018, because we talked about that on slide 14. So what's going on? Well, let's go look at the, here's what I would assert. I think that the manuals were just amphibying with us. Okay, that one was super, super bad. But that's going to be, I hope, the worst joke of our thing. So let's look at the manual. Oh yeah, it's from March of 2017. That regulation was changed in 2018. They didn't keep up with it. Oops. So manuals aren't binding, and outdated manuals are extra non-binding. Which brings us to, actually, maybe this is the worst pun coming up. Looking in the manuals, people do it all of the time. It's useful. It is not legal research because they aren't binding. If you find something in the manuals that suggests you might need to refund, I'm begging you, don't do it. You need something in the statute or in the regulation. And so to continue our bad pun parade, let me give you the Lynn manual Miranda warning. So it's just so bad. So the Miranda warning, of course, as you know, is you have the right to remain silent. Anything you do can and will be used against you will be used against you in a court of law. If you watch cop shows on TV, you know this, right? It's named after a case where the defendant, Mr. Miranda, went to the Supreme Court and got his conviction tossed out because he didn't know about his rights. Well, the Lynn manual Miranda warning is that the manuals aren't binding. Don't forget it. So I'm hoping that Monsieur Miranda here will help you keep that in mind at all times. All right. Now I want to get into a few real-world examples. So first, real-world example. The physician wants to keep the patient because the patient doesn't have transportation to return for follow-up. I came up here to be in a blizzard. And so it sort of disappointed me. There's 21 inches of snow a mile away from me, and I am too close to the lake. I've got 3 piddly inches of snow, but really big waves. But if you had been up here, right, and you were in the hospital, they might want to keep you because it was going to be a really tough day to get around. But, or maybe you don't have a car, right? And we know we need to get you back tomorrow for your MRI, and so we're keeping you. Is that a valid admission? Well, I don't think so. Because I think that the absence of transportation, I don't know that fits us under any of the tests that we'll look at again in a minute on the regulation, right? The test was you had to require hospital care. And I don't think that this person requires hospital care, they require transportation. So that's a difference, and I don't love this one. Now, one thing to keep in mind, there is a safe harbor out there for local medical transportation. So if this is the problem your person is trying to solve, my recommendation would be pay for their transportation. Get them an Uber. And people worry, well, is that a kickback? There is a safe harbor to protect it. I'm not super worried about it. I think you're okay doing that. So I think there's a solution to this problem that is not keeping them in the hospital. Now, as a lawyer, I think I have at least two jobs. One of my jobs is to get people out of trouble, but another one of my jobs is to try to keep people out of trouble. And that means I sometimes am coming up with the most creative argument I can to justify something after the fact. That's to get someone out of trouble. And I also want to give advice ahead of time that keeps you out of trouble, right? They're kind of parallel. And so I'm going to tell you, here's what I think you should do, but here's what I could defend. This is in the here's what I could defend department. So the manual has some language that says that admission, factors to be considered when making an admission decision, the need for diagnostic studies that appropriately are outpatient services, i.e. their performance doesn't ordinarily require the patient to remain at the hospital for 24 hours. Now that's a thing to consider. I don't even know, this is really poorly written. Which way does it influence stuff? Does it mean if they're available, you can admit them, or if they're not available, it's a factor to be considered, and it doesn't explain how. In a pinch, this is what I'd use, but I would say send that person home. All right, that's just not how I'm going to get there. Now, our next scenario. The physician's worried that if the patient is home alone, they might die. Valid admission. Now, to me, this one shouldn't be controversial. But I think it is, because some people are like, well, why should, if the doctor will let them go home with a spouse, but they live alone, that shouldn't make a difference as to whether they need hospital care or not. And I would say it absolutely can, right? The regulation doesn't require that someone have their family come over, right? You don't have to go get a neighbor to keep an eye on you. If unsupervised, you are at high risk of dying in the next 48 hours, I think that's a reason to be admitted to the hospital. I would defend that one until the cows come home, all right? Now, so I think it's good. The fact that I would defend it isn't necessarily enough. Let's look at the regulation again. So the regulation says that there's an expectation that should be based on their patient's medical factors, their history, and the risk of an adverse event. I would say death very much is an adverse event. And so the fact that the person might die at home, I think falls squarely into what the regulation is talking about here, right? I will just put in a thing. I am confident we will have time for questions. So if you've got them, type them. So language, I have mentioned it today. I've mentioned it on Monitor Monday. I am a big fan of precise language. One area of imprecise language is talking about a social admission. And so I would try not to use the term, because what does it mean? Sometimes the social admission is they couldn't get a ride home, right? That's super different from they don't have the care they need at home. Those are different things. they're both, as Tiffany Ferguson on Monitor Monday would say, is it social determinants of health, right? They are both social determinants of health, but they're really, really, really different. And so I think that the care, to me, is what hospitals provide, right? Because the Two-Midnight Rule is that you need to require hospital care. Now, I don't know exactly what that is, but if it's something now I feel like I'm about to pay $25,000 pyramid, things you'll find in a hospital, right? Taxi is not one of them, right? You won't find a taxi in a hospital. That is not needing hospital care. Nursing care is. And it's really interesting. If you look at the definition of inpatient hospital services in the manual, this is the kinds of things they consider to be hospital services. The second one is nursing services and other related services. And I kind of feel like if the person needs nursing care for 2 nights, that feels like a justification for a hospital stay. Now, I will attack my own position. Well, then why isn't everyone who's in a skilled nursing facility also eligible for hospital reimbursement? And I will acknowledge some difficulty I have articulating that difference. But it's only some difficulty. And I think everyone, right? I think almost everyone would, to some extent. Where is that line crossed and what is it? So, because clearly bed and board alone isn't enough, right? But if you look at the other things on here, I don't think that this stuff differentiates in the material, and you don't need all of the stuff on here, right? It isn't like if someone doesn't need if you're not on drugs, you can't possibly be in a hospital. So it isn't you need each of things 1 through 7. It's you need some of them. And I don't know what those some are. So, all right. This is my mushy part of the talk where I am sympathetic to people struggling. But when struggling, I'm going to use common sense. And I'm going to say, if that person needs someone to keep an eye on them for a short period of time, a day or 2, so that they don't die, I feel okay defending that decision to admit them. All right. So now I want to know, does the Quality Improvement Organization Manual help us sort through this? Have you never heard of the Quality Improvement Organization Manual? Well, until I was getting ready for this talk, I had not either. I don't know how much weight to give it. So Bush League is really just a chance for me, to put this picture up. And so this is not a bush. It turns out it's a tree. It's a tree with an eagle in it. The reason I wonder if it's Bush League, though, this manual was last updated in 2003, early in the Bush administration. I mean, this is old, right? So it's old, it's still out there, and here is what it says. Review the medical record and use appropriate use criteria to determine if an admission to a PPS, prospective payment, or non-PPS hospital should be referred for physician review. The case is referred to a physician reviewer when the non-physician reviewer can't approve the hospitalization is necessary and or another level of care would have been appropriate without posing a threat to the safety or health of the patient. Now, there's a lot going on here to unpack. First thing, it's focusing in on that health and safety of a patient, right? So that's if they're going to die, if they're not in the hospital, there's a risk of it. It's not they're going to die, right? But they're at risk of dying. That's a factor that they think you can consider. Also, note here that they're telling you they're telling this is to the contractor. The contractor should use a physician reviewer. Here is a little known secret. There is manual language in the claims processing manual that says if the contractor uses a physician reviewer to determine whether a service is necessary or not, that suggests that the situation is unclear and the provider would be without fault. And if you're without fault, the government can't recover an overpayment with you. And so I think I put that poorly, but putting it into plain English, if the government needs to use a physician reviewer, there's an argument you shouldn't have an overpayment. That reasonable people can differ and there's no overpayment present. I feel a little guilty when I use this provision because I like it when the government uses a a physician reviewer, but just know that it's out there. So this is that manual language I was alluding to. I'm not going to read it. It's just in the materials for your edification. All right, so here's some more of that quality improvement manual. So factors that may result in an inconvenience to a patient or family do not by themselves justify inpatient admission. But I underline the by themselves because that means they're not irrelevant, right? Like the putting in the by themselves to me means they go in the hopper, they're not determinative. Because if you wanted to say they don't matter, you'd say should not be considered. And that is not what they said. They said they don't by themselves. When such factors affect the patient's health, consider them in determining whether inpatient hospitalization was appropriate. Whoa! That is the opposite of do not consider them. That is consider them and how they impact things. The social determinants of health matter. The Quality Improvement Organization Manual says so. So inpatient care rather than outpatient care is required only if the patient's medical condition, safety, or health would be significantly and directly threatened if the care was provided in a less intensive setting. Without accompanying medical condition, factors that may cause patient inconvenience in terms of time and money needed to care for the patient at home or for travel to a physician's office, or that may cause the patient to worry, do not justify continued hospital stay. But without accompanying medical conditions, that's if the person is the worried well. But if they have a medical condition, you get to take this stuff into account. All right. Now, I want to spend a moment ragging on Covent Bridge. So Covent Bridge, which is a UPIC, went after a boatload of my clients throughout the country, all at the same time. My sense of time is off, about a year ago. And they had some gems in their letter. They said the patient only required an outpatient level of care. There's no such thing as an outpatient level of care. This difference between inpatient and outpatient is not the type of care the person needs. It's the length of time. Remember, what does it take for a person to need to be an inpatient? They need hospital care for 2 midnights. If it is outpatient level of care for 2 midnights, it's inpatient because it isn't the type of care. The difference between inpatient and outpatient is not the type of care you're receiving. It is the time over which you are receiving it. If you're expecting it to be over 2 midnights, it's inpatient. If you're not expecting it to be over 2 midnights, it's outpatient. But the care that people get might be absolutely identical. All right. So Dave Mason, I use Dave Mason all the time. There ain't no good guy. There ain't no bad guy. There's only you and me, and we just disagree. Well, there ain't no inpatient level of care. There ain't no outpatient level of care. There's just care. I get a little worked up on that one. So you're waiting for a sniff bed. Can you be in the hospital? The patient's ready to go to rehab, but there's no sniff bed. This is another one of those, I had no idea. So this Quality Improvement Organization Manual, Chapter 7. In cases where the beneficiary requires a sniff level of care, the hospital can't issue a notice of non-coverage if the sniff bed is not available. Medicare pays hospitals for days awaiting placement until a sniff bed is available, and the medical record documentation indicates that sniff placement is being actively sought. I had no idea. All right, so my closing thoughts. This is my last 2 slides and we'll do questions. I think that the 2 midnight rule isn't as hard as people make it out to, right? Some things are pretty clear. I think the 2 midnight test is straightforward. There are definitely no levels of care. What's hard for me? Well, the awaiting a sniff thing still is a little bit gray. And I really struggle with, it would be dangerous to send the person home, right? Like how do the social determinants of health get in there? And I really struggle with how much certainty should the doctor have? If the doctor thinks there's a 75% chance the patient will be in for 2 nights, is that enough? Or is a 50% chance enough, 51% chance? I struggle with that. And then I think you should fight if a Medicare Advantage plan tries to use a 3-midnight rule, fight them like mad. If it's a non-Medicare payer, you need to know what their standard is. So my colleague Katie Ilton once had an appeal with a state Medicaid plan. The state Medicaid plan had a particular criteria that was supposed to be used in order to determine their status. So they didn't use their own rule, right? That happens a lot. It is common for Medicare and private companies to fail to follow their own rules. So the Ilton axiom, make sure people follow their rules, and then please, 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 please never make me say again, don't follow the manual. All right, we're time for questions. I don't remember if I stuck my contact information on the last thing here. I think I did.
Yeah.
If I can advance, there we go. So that's me.
Yeah.
I will mention my firm does free monthly webinars. If you want to be on our free monthly webinar list, if you aren't already, send me an email, or you can just Google Fredrikson Health Law webinars. And we also give HCCA credit for ours. So you're welcome to join that list. All right, Denise, hit me with questions.
Great. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's interesting when you talk about MA plans and the Two-Midnight Rule. So I have heard, anecdotally from some of our members that a good number, I think, actually use that as part of their argument to the MA plans, some with success and a lot without success. But I do think that's something that we need to be more cognizant of and maybe, push a little bit, push back on a little bit more consistently and stringently. Okay, so we had quite a few questions about, as you said, the SNF and, whether they're an inpatient, if they need a SNF, but they're, not a bed available. So you've answered a good number of those. That was asked by several folks. Okay.
And I will just add to those people, like I said, I learned that this is a learning process, and maybe something to keep in mind, always know that there might be something out there you do not know. Because I am reminded of that constantly. I did not know that provision was out there until 6 months ago.
Okay, here's one. If the anticipation is not 2 midnight, say they come in, to have like a total knee done where they, might go home that day or maybe only stay over one night, but then the patient stays 2 midnight because they're having problems with pain management, or they're not advancing in PT or OT, would you advance that to inpatient?
Absolutely. So I should have mentioned this. So thank you for this is a major short. You should never, ever, 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 ever have a Medicare patient in your hospital who is there for a second midnight without being admitted, right? At 11:59 p.m. after they've been there for 1 midnight, they're going to be there for 2 midnight. They should be admitted. And the bummer, the part of the reason it's important to get it straight at the beginning, you guys know this is better than I, right, is like the 3-day qualification for SNF coverage, right? So you're shorting a person. If you don't admit them fast enough, you may not be giving them enough days of hospital stay for that. But you cannot have a valid 3-day observation stay. By that 3rd day, they're going to be in for more than 2 midnights. That was part of what Covenbridge did that was wrong. They were denying some 3- and 4-day stays as having there been I should be clear about one thing. I suppose if someone's argument is the person didn't need to be in the hospital at all, then you could question it, right? But as long as you agree that they needed hospital care, then it's all right. And so yes, admit them, to answer that more succinctly.
Okay, and I think we might have time for one more question. So this person says they reviewed a record for the SNF admissions transfers because the patient must meet the 3 qualifying inpatient nights. The key is qualifying Some hospitals only make sure they meet inpatient status and do not follow the qualifying stay requirement. What is your take on this? I don't know if I understood the question.
Yeah, I don't know if I totally did either, Denise, but I guess the one thing I get, people sometimes start wanting to apply various criteria in here, right? As soon as the person, I don't know if I totally followed that one either, but if you think they're going to be in for 2 midnights, admit them, and then the chips fall where they may, right? I think the hardest one for me is there isn't currently a mechanism to relate admission back, and I wish there was, and I think there should be. You know, that you kind of, in essence, you retro back so that at 11:59 on the second day, kind of that first day should count. CMS doesn't do it yet that way. I wish they would, but that's not up to me.
All right. Well, we're up to the top of the hour. Thank you, everyone who attended. Thank you so much, David, for being our guest speaker today. I love it when all I have to do is introduce someone and let you speak. And I'm going to go back to a lot of your slides there. You gave me some good ideas for things, for some additional arguments, you know, in some of our appeals. So appreciate it very much. And thanks, everyone, for attending today. Thanks, David. Everyone have a great rest of your day, and we will see you in January.
Be well.